All right. Hello, everyone. We have made it to our final keynote of the Strategy Summit, and it is going to be a good one. It's crafting an effective learning strategy from concept to SOAP. As always, submit questions in the Q&A section and collaborate with other attendees in the chat. Our sessions are recorded and available after the session ends, and please go ahead and complete the survey upon exiting each session. So it is now my pleasure to introduce to you our speakers, Sean Stowers and William Ryan. Sean Stowers is founder, CLO, and CEO of WeLearn, where his mission is to build better humans through learning and to collaborate with people he loves. Prior to founding WeLearn, Sean held various roles at global education, consulting, and publishing firms, working across industries to launch global customer training programs, implement strategic outsourcing initiatives, lead teams in creating award-winning learning experiences, and advise corporations on educational assistance and workforce development. Bill Ryan, PhD, has designed solutions for government, corporate, and healthcare clients, including Center for Internet Security, Liberty Mutual, Delta Faucet, and state college systems. He holds a PhD in computing technology and education and introducing emerging models like workflow learning to equip workforces with agile problem solving. Sean and Bill, it is an honor to have you here at the Strategy Summit, and the floor is all yours.
Marissa, thank you for that great introduction. I'm going to agree with some comments in the comments that you have great earrings today. So thank you.
Thank you.
And as we get started, I want to just thank you both, everyone, for joining Bill and I for the closing keynote. That was a great introduction, but more importantly, you can call us those guys. And so with that, I'm going to turn it over to my friend and colleague, Bill Ryan, to get us kicked off today. So Bill, over to you.
I will do that. Let me put the share into place here. Let's see. So many buttons. So few windows. So welcome, everyone. Thank you for spending this afternoon with us here in the land of online. And I'm pushing buttons. And as we started today, I was already seeing the chat. Hey, Dolores. And somebody says hi. I want to say hi back. And I want everybody else to give us an idea here. You're here. You're talking about strategy. But what do you want? What do you consider, from a learning strategy? What is your focus? What is your intent? And why do you even see the need? So throw it in the chat. I'm kind of curious here. I know Sean is too. I want to see what's going on in your minds in terms of the idea of a strategy, job security, provide direction. Provide direction to who? I want to know a little more of the roadmap, Jennifer. That's a great one. Tell us a little bit more about the roadmap. Robert's with you there too. Roadmap for who? That's a curious thing. Oh, I love that, Thaddeus. That's a great one right there. That is a terrific one. Inspire. I think one of the things that comes into our conversation at this point in time is that the focus, as Daniel kind of points out there, is, I think, a key part of what these strategies can bring. And when we look ahead, one of the things that I think is important is that having a well-defined strategy is really crucial for the organization's success. So, Kristen, you just brought up a really good point. The team and the employee, but it's also how it builds up for the organization. Individual growth, it is a process, but when you think about this, because learning is a strategic business tool, but it's centered on people, focused on performance, but then permeates across the organization. And I think this is the kind of things that kind of go back and forth across the organization. And I love how you said that weave in different modalities, Alicia. That's a really, really good point that comes into play. And when we think about the things that kind of come into play, there's a lot of parts, there's a lot of pieces that come into these components, things that you have to include, objectives that meet the organization's needs, that have focus on individual development, but again, aligning to mission and vision, a thorough understanding of the learners. What do they know? What do they need to know? What do they need to be able to do? What are the things that have to be created or can be intermixed between organizations and teams to help build people? The whole idea of the mix. Someone earlier said this, different modalities, in person, e-learning, on the job, coaching. Again, tailored to the content, tailored to the community. And I think a learning strategy has a very realistic schedule for implementation. That's sometimes something we sometimes forget a little bit about, the realistic aspects of what we can do with the milestones, the resources we have, the dates that we can do things with. Because I don't know about you folks, but some of my people I worked have, everyone was number one in terms of need. So how do we balance those kind of things? And this is where I think the idea that these components all build in toward a strategy, the processes that help you put in place, ways to get input, the ways to build for the future are all part of these things that create a very robust strategy, along with the things that manage in terms of governance, managing change, but also managing for the performance success of the people involved as well. There's a lot of things that's in it for you. And I think that's a kind of component that has to be considered too. What's the value proposition? And it starts with you. One of the key benefits, I think, is for us from a learning perspective, is the idea that we shift from being order takers to performance supporters. We move from reactive to proactive. And I think one of the things that happens is when we get to focus, we can do it with intention. So we can look at the ideas of how we can positively affect performance, the productivity, and that impacts the overall growth of the person. And at that point, then we're starting to impact the business too. I think the idea that we can do what Haley's talking about, and Dolores, that is a really good point, the world building, is that when we look at this from a strategic perspective, the idea that we can create this kind of complete holistic development process is something that I think we all bring to an organization, but it lets L&D start to be much more intentional about how we're impacting the organization. We're not just putting out a fire. We're the idea that we're actually helping to build the platform for the organization to build on and to be successful going forward. And Sean's going to share with us the idea that there's some key steps in terms of building this learning strategy.
So, Bill, thank you. And I think that we often are asked, well, how do you build a learning strategy? And as L&D folks and as consultants, we love a good model. So here is our model for 4 steps to building a learning strategy. And the first one begins with identify the success construct. So when you think about that, it really isn't about like, hey, what would be success for learning specifically? It's really about understanding the organization's goals and what is success for the organization. Really understand the strategy of the organization, whether that is the organization as a whole or understanding a specific line of business within the organization or even a specific department. The second is to make sure that you are reviewing and listening to your audience. So, as you identify that success construct and all of the information involved there, how do you then turn that into listening to your audience? And when we talk about listening to your audience, it's not just your NPS score, it's not just your, it's not just the data in your LMS. It's actually listening to your audience deeply. This is where you're going to bring in strategies like one-on-one meetings, focus groups, interviews. And in those conversations, you're not only looking to validate your understanding of what you learned by researching the organization and validating the success construct, but you're going to be asking for ideas and suggestions. You're going to be asking about how individuals currently experience learning, what were learning experiences that they've had maybe outside the organization that have been meaningful to them and super impactful. And Bill, I think we are about to go into step 3.
I think you did second. You were reviewing key information.
Yep.
So I missed something. I apologize.
Nope. So we've talked about listen. So let's go to the third step, which is synthesize and codify. So, hey, you've done that listening, you've done that work, and now it's time to bring that together and really make sure that you've understood what you heard. And at this step, we usually call this a findings report. And what we're really doing at this point is making sure, and going back to the audiences that we met with, making sure that we represent their stories and their needs deeply. making sure that we've understood them and what they meant to convey to us. And again, if you've done this right and you've had conversations at all levels of the organization, you're going to see certain trends emerge, certain themes emerge, and this is an opportunity to validate those things. You begin to align those findings and those needs to the strategic goals of the organization. And at that point, you're going to begin to identify missing and complementary drivers and understand, hey, how does this all work together? And what's so important at this level is you begin to connect people and purpose and link that to performance. The last step in this process is really finalizing the plan. This is where you're beginning to connect the stories that you heard in your listing phase and what you validated as you were synthesizing and codifying information back to specific inputs and initiatives across the organization. This is where you begin to establish governance for your learning organization. And I know that in this audience today, we have folks that work in big learning organizations that could have, 20, 30, hundreds of employees. I know that there are folks listening today that are departments of one. Governance of the learning function is equally as important no matter the size of the organization. And so you begin to establish some governance around how learning happens and how it's driven. You're developing resource allocation plans, roles and responsibility frameworks. You develop your communication plan, and we're going to talk a little bit more about communication as we get into what SOAP means here in a little bit. But you're also developing your risk in your measurement plan. So this for us, identifying the success construct, listen, synthesize and codify, and finalize the plan are our 4 steps for building a learning strategy in an organization. I think then when we talk about this, everything for us starts with conversation. So we like to call these clarity conversations. And so when we work with organizations to help put together their learning strategies, these are the conversations that we start with. So we don't jump in and immediately say, okay, let's talk about the 5 things you want to get done in learning. We really want to use this opportunity to make sure that we understand the business deeply. So, here you notice that we're asking questions about each of the line of business. We're asking about 3 to 5 year business plans. We're asking about, are there key opportunities to capitalize on? But we're also asking questions about how proficient is defined. We're asking questions that are about the business of the organization. We're asking questions about how they measure learning. We're asking questions about learning modality. And I think that, and Dolores, you put a great question here about how do you encourage information sharing without going down a rabbit hole. What I would say to you is that you begin to, as you review the information and you start going into your information sharing sessions, I think that what you do and what we do is we build interview guides. We build a standard script of questions that we're going to use uniformly across the organization so that we know that we're getting the consistency in terms of what we're looking to examine. Again, those interview guides, though, start with forming sort of clarity conversations and making sure that we know maybe what ground has been covered, what hasn't been covered. And so if you can, as we continue on, and I think what we really find is that conversations lead to clarity. And so as we look to build, and Bill, we can move to the next slide.
Before you go too far, because there was a great point in here, and I wanted to make sure that while we had a moment, just to its breadth and depth, but it's also about that conversation. So I think the sending a form, Miles, as you were thinking about it, is like we actually for us, I think the focus is it's got to be that high touch. It's got to be that while you keep the guide and as Dolores says, the challenge is sticking to the script, because when you start to pull the strings, as you're talking to people from all the different levels and across the organization, and you start to see themes that come out, but that ability to have the conversation on a personal level, even in small focus groups, becomes very, very important. And you get to hear both the timbre, but you also hear the tones that come out of this. So I think it's really, really important, the points that are being made about this and the value that they bring.
Bill, I think that's a great point. And again, I think that forms and surveys can be one form of data collection. But here's the thing. I think that the work of deeply connecting your organization's learning strategy to the organization's strategies and how the organization manages to success is not going to come out of sending out a survey. That deep connection of connecting people and purpose to proficiency really is going to be driven by conversation. And that can be conversations that happen at scale or happen one-on-one, but I think that's what's super important. What we find is conversations lead to clarity. And so as you begin again to have these conversations, you look at how are things decided in the organization. You as a learning organization, maybe launching as a shared service. How have other shared services organizations worked in the organization? You begin to ask questions of what happens when there are too many requests of the learning team, and we'll talk a little bit about some of the ways that you handle that from a governance perspective. Kristen, great question. Daisy, it's a version of RACI, so it's decider, advised, consulted, and influenced. So it's just another version of RACI. So I think and by the way, it's connecting people and purpose to proficiency. That's what I said and which Bill got. So thank you for asking that question, Dolores. But again, I think at the end of the day, conversations are what lead us to clarity. And so that brings us to again, where we come to strategy and where we start. And that's really that we start with the end in mind. And what do we mean by that? And really for us, that means first and foremost, that we're focused on the strategy of the business, that we're talking to stakeholders early and often, and that from the time that we begin our findings to the time we form our plans to how we define the metrics, that we are in a constant conversation with our stakeholders, because ultimately they're the ones that are holding us accountable and measuring us. Two, we focus on governance. So it's great to have a learning strategy. It's great to say, hey, we want to do all of these things in the organization. But if you don't have governance, if you don't have a way that you are, in my parlance, sports parlance, calling balls and strikes when requests are coming in, you are going to get eaten alive by the organization because you're going to be running in 22 different directions. The third piece is really around action. So within a learning and development function, there are really three types of decisions that you can make around action. That is, we are going to build it. And that means you are likely going to build it internally. We're going to buy it because we can find it off the shelf, or we're going to have to partner to build it, which means you're going to have to go outside. And each one of those decisions needs to be taken both in terms of the strategic importance and impact that it has on the organization, how important is how strategic is in specific as the content to the organization. So are these things that are so proprietary to you that you have to own and only you can do it? But it's also going to have to do with how that particular piece of content or that particular initiative is going to advance the organization. So that decision of build, buy, or partner is super important. Measure and monitor. How are you going to measure and monitor? And I will say that as a provider in the marketplace, very few times are we ever along for the ride long enough for the longitudinal measures of success. Our job as a partner is to help make sure that you know what you want to measure, help know where you get that data, and ensure that you have a process to do it. But ultimately, you as an L&D team are going to be monitoring the success in the long term. The next thing is really, how do you put this in the context of the flow of work? We all know formal learning, it's there, but at the end of the day, what we want to make sure and what you want to make sure is that when the learning has to be applied, most importantly at the moment of need in the flow of work, that if learners need to refresh that learning, they need to access that learning, that they can do so in a easy way. And then finally, how do you support this overall? And how do you support the learning organization? How do you support your learners? How do you support your stakeholders? Nicholas, you put a really interesting thing in the chat about hearing the term stakeholders at the conference, and that should that population be different in levels and what influence? So here's what I would say is, when we talk about stakeholders, we recognize that there are stakeholders of multiple types. So there are senior leadership stakeholders, those that are at the top of the organization. There are People manage their stakeholders, people that manage teams, but it is important to remember that learners, your learners, rank and file learners, are stakeholders. So when we talk about doing a stakeholder conversation, we are talking about all aspects and all levels of the organization. You are talking to the individual contributors, the employees that are on the front lines, and you're asking them the same questions that you're asking your C-suite. And now some of those questions may change in terms of the contextual application of the question, but you're asking all of them. So Nicholas is a great point. When we talk about stakeholders, we're not just talking about your C-suite. We're not just talking about your people leaders. We're talking about individuals at all levels that are really the consumers of what the learning and development organization is putting together. So Bill, I'm going to turn it back to you because I think we're going to start diving into, if you're doing this right, how do you begin to communicate this to the workforce?
Well, I'm going to ask people to throw stuff in the chat, but Nicholas, I think that point that Sean was just finishing up on is, and you had asked a little bit about, if there's more workers, and this isn't about a volume, but it is about a focus, I think, at times. So in conversations that I am, very thankful to have sometimes with the, people that are in the line of the work in the operational space, they bring insights often about the barriers, often about the flow that the C-suite doesn't know about. They miss it. And this is the opportunity to start bringing learning as a strategic business tool into the discussion in the C-suite, because here's the actual performance, the people in the performance flow bringing up the questions. And that allows you to start creating in the strategic plan this whole idea of insights and being able to bring back things that are going to matter to the operations that maybe at times are so granular that they're past where the C-suite is, but are vital at the same point. So this is where it comes into the whole communication process. And I think there's a lot of things that come into how you communicate to things, and OKRs are a great way of doing it. I think there's presentations, video presentations to leadership is a great way of doing it. Marketing strategy, that's an interesting point, Ian, and I think you should expand a little bit on that, because I think that's a part of this communication process. And I think what we're trying to get past is that, being a reactive process. When you start being strategic, you can start being intentional. When you can start being intentional, you're not putting out the fires anymore. You can start to have these kind of conversations across the organizations. And that brings us up to one of the first comments I saw when we were getting into this session is somebody couldn't wait to see what SOAP meant. It's a strategy on a page. So when I think about communications, sometimes one of the hardest things to bring is, you bring a plan out, and I'm sure everyone has seen some kind of strategic plan. And the issue, funny, Dolores, thank you. I'm chuckling still, is, these big documents. And what do those documents get? You need something that people can understand. And a strategy on a page is this kind of a concise, this is just a design. There's lots of designs. We'll show you a different one in a minute. But it's a visual representation of the key strategic elements in a single one-page document. Now, it usually includes some of the typical components you're going to see here: mission, vision, objectives. Sometimes OKRs are included in this, key initiatives, certain kinds of metrics that may be there. But it's simple, it's structured, and it's a quick reference tool that allows you to communicate and align your various stakeholders at all levels across the organization on the very essential parts of what you're trying to bring to the organization, a learning strategy. It makes it accessible, it makes it actionable for everyone to understand. It gives you a place to start having a shared conversation where everybody is together with it. And I think one of the things that comes into play when you look at this is, and we'll get to the details later, but this brings the broader view into a manageable state that you can start saying, how will this impact me being the stakeholder now? And you as consultant have the opportunity to start saying, here's how we're going to work together. And again, now we're moving away from, order taker. We're now partnering. And I think that the key part of this is building that. And Jennifer, your question is a really good one. I think it's more about dependence, but you can do a little bit of both, and I'll show you what I mean in just a minute. Here's an actual example. I'm going to let Sean have the details on this one, but here's another way of looking at this strategy on a page.
Yep. So Bill, thank you. And Jennifer wrote, and Bill's exactly right. We're going to get to your point about single or multiple years. This is actually an example of a strategy on a page that we worked with a learning organization to design. So they're, just by way of a background, they were an organization that the prior year had established an L&D organization. They had an L&D director. They were building out their L&D team. They knew that they needed a strategic plan, and they actually decided to invest in developing their strategic plan before they did things like buy an LMS. So the process that we worked with them in this particular case is we worked with them over 90 days. We did the needs analysis conversations in partnership with the L&D organization and individuals that were identified as learning champions in each of their lines of business. We interviewed over 50 people in 25 different settings in terms of focus groups, webinars, one-on-one meetings, debrief meetings, etc. And this drove the creation of this strategy. And you notice that there were really three types of areas that we focused on, which was collaboration, leadership, and prioritization of development. What we knew that they wanted to operate, they really wanted to be seen as operating as a dynamic learning organization. And by the way, there were some principles around innovation, celebrating success, and learning partnership that were super, super important. What we found is when we built this, and we worked with them to build the strategy, is we then moved into the idea of how do you begin to prioritize the work of the plan. And so maybe we can continue on, and I think this gets to, the conversation of should this be a single year or multiple year. So we can, what we really sought to do was to drive for clarity. And so here we got into working with the L&D team, with their stakeholders, with their leadership to identify what were the things that they wanted to invest in the most, that the learning organization could have the most impact for. So keep in mind, we are coming back to a concept that we talked about at the beginning, which was clarity, right? So now we've heard you. These are all the things you say you want to work on. Now, how do we begin to determine the things that we want to address first? And as we got to clarity, then we got to the plan. And then and what you'll see, Jennifer, is the plan actually lays out over multiple quarters and over 2 years' time. So when we think about the strategy process that we've laid out, there's a model for how do you get the inputs to the strategy. There's then driving to that clarity and forming the plan. I think Bill said something really important, which is, a big part of the learning strategy is making sure you have the resources to accomplish what you want to accomplish, and you have the time frame in which you want to accomplish it. So you can see here, this laid out over multiple quarters, over a 2-year period, and this was really what they wanted to take on next as they moved into implementing their learning organization and tied to the strategy of the organization. What becomes super important is if we have clarity and we have a plan, we come back to that idea of how do you call balls and strikes on what the learning organization does. And so one of the things that becomes super important, and Bill, you went backwards.
I did on purpose. I wanted to bring out one highlight was that one of the, I'm sorry, I missed a name in here so already, but one of the things that this also highlights is the idea that we go from a very large kind of high level view, the strategic, the SOAP, but this is where you get the ability to start having that kind of tactical decision or discussions, excuse me. This is where you actually get into that whole conversation about with your partners now, about the things that you can do to start implementing these, and you can have that at a more granular level. So it allows you the combination to have this fluidity, and then you can start making the plan and showing this is when it's going to be impacted. We're not throwing everything, we're not throwing the whole, bucket of spaghetti on the wall. There's a plan. It's intentional. And in that intention, there's also where the parameters are.
And then that brings us to the next piece of this, which is really about defining the scope of the learning organization and the L&D organization. And I think, again, whether you're a department of 1 or you're a department of 4 or 5 or you're a department of 400, you have to define what it is that you do. And you have to be able to say what is in scope for the L&D organization and what is out of scope. And in this particular case with this particular partner, they had an L&D team that was new in forming, and there was a very specific function that they could take. They had a learning champion model that had of teams that had been identified sitting in the business. There was this very specific scope of what they did, but we had to very specifically say, what did L&D not support and what? And by the way, this was super important to know this up front, because this is the foundation of how when needs came into the learning organization, this is the first thing that they went to begin to say, okay, how do we field this request? How do we call a ball or a strike on this type of request? And so this is super important from a governance perspective, because it allows you to then say, okay, is this coming in? Is this in our scope? And if it's not, where does it belong in the organization? Now, what's also important is as you come up with the scope is this, what's in scope and out of scope is, number one, recognize that this may evolve over time based on the org design of your learning organization, the capabilities that you have. Recognize that this could evolve over time based on the nature of the needs and the way the needs are expressed to the business, from the business to the training organization. But at its core, this is super important for ensuring that the L&D organization can focus on the work of, again, connecting people to purpose and proficiency. And this was super important to that work. Bill, I'm going to let you kind of bring us home, and then we can open it up for questions.
I think one of the things that this strategy on a page, helps kind of present to you is a way to highlight that alignment to the business, and where the focus is where learning leads to people's success as they perform their roles. It starts with getting into the field, though. Ask everybody, talk to everybody, find out what they need to succeed, what they need to grow. Listen, be their advocate. I've always been a real strong believer that we are the learner's advocate, and gain the insights that they share to bring back to help the leadership sometimes understand where perhaps things are in the way and they don't even know about it. And so this is an opportunity to really get into the community and support the people where you are. It's also a great way to bring out to everyone involved, all of stakeholders, what the resource limitations are: technology, people, funding, whatever they are, but to be clear about what you can and cannot deliver. I think we've all been caught at some point in time getting stuck in that overcommit phase, and it doesn't help anybody. So this is a chance to be upfront and be very, very clear and transparent. And again, creating that partnership has the conversations is where it begins. Governance, can't say enough about it. You got to be clear about people's roles and responsibilities, what the intake process is, how work is prioritized, what's a fire, what's not, and make sure you work that plan very openly. The more transparent you are across the stakeholder community, the better people come together when you need to have that partnership actually lead for more planning. So that's a good thing to use. Don't forget to measure. And when you measure success, do it in terms of the operation. Do it in terms of the business. What do they consider success? Use their metrics. Measure the solutions. Communicate to everybody. Monitor the changes. And when you have to, manage expectations and revise accordingly. All these things come together, and you can bring them into a very clear communication tool using the strategy on a page. And that's what we wanted to bring out and share at this point in time. And hopefully, you can take something and bring it back to, your organization and use it as well. And now we'll open it up and just say, what questions do you have?
All right. Last keynote of the Strategy Summit did not disappoint. Let's jump into these questions. If you do have questions for Sean and Bill, of course, you want to pop open the Q&A pod, post them in there. I'm going to kick us off with this question from
Susie, who wants to know, can you provide an example of a successful L&D strategy that moved from being reactive to proactive, and what were the key steps involved in making the transition?
Susie, that's a mouthful of a question.
Right?
Susie, here's the thing I will tell you. I think that the act of going through the strategy process that we laid out to you moves you from reactive to proactive, right? I think that that is, and I think even the example that we gave you with a client, as I said, they started a new L&D organization. Then they put the strategy in place. Prior to that, they were not an organization that wasn't investing in L&D. They actually invested in L&D. They had no strategy around it. It wasn't aligned to anything. So here's what we know that's happened since we did that work, and that work was done about 2 years ago. One, the director of L&D was promoted to senior director of L&D. Senior director of L&D's team grew from 4 to 7 people. They are now looking at the LMS implementation. So I think what we see in that example, again, wasn't an organization that wasn't investing in learning, because they were doing it. It was ad hoc. It was like when people raised their hands, they were doing it. I think with the strategy, we began to see that intention of connecting learning to the business strategy. When the organization goals are handed down, there are specific organizational goals established for business. And as a result of the success that has been built in that strategy, we see the learning organization growing. We're seeing the scope of the learning organization increasing, and ultimately their impact. So I think that that's a great example of where that's happened. Bill, you may have another.
I actually have another world work example of a situation, and it's not R&D. It was in a call center environment, but at that time there were 8 lines of business, and the way the L&D organization was taking it was literally first in, first out. So the workflow was just, whoever came through and had this issue in the line of business, they just took it and produced it. And I was a part of this, as you might figure out. And so I came back and said, no, we need to stop this. And I went back into the business and said, if we don't do this for you, what's the financial impact? Because in this call center, they were dealing with some insurance questions, and that had state by state regulations, and it impacted human beings at some point in time. And there could be fines involved in that process, or improper payouts. So getting all those stakeholders at the operational level together and say, what constitutes a fire? What constitutes a level 1? We really got to change this and make this training request a number 1. Came together because we were able to create this kind of strategy and have them and literally have this description of like what's in scope, what's out of scope. What's a fire? What's not a fire? Let's triage this, but let's agree across the lines of the business. And they were actually able to come back and show that there were fines that were avoided because they started being more strategic about how they use the learning resources. So I think that this is, again, where you have the opportunity to, measure performance and make the impact of the business be part of the strategic plan.
All right, Dolores is getting a lot of shout outs in this session, but let's keep it going here because she's got a great question in the Q&A. How do you recommend handling changes to the strategy that came about because there were changes in the organization? Things like layoffs, reorgs. Learning is often left out of the loop until that's done and over with, and it's happening. So how do you respond to it?
I think I have a perspective on this, and then I know Bill does. So my perspective, being an outside, having never worked inside of a company and always been as a provider, is I think it comes back to, if we're doing as L&D, if we're doing the job that we set out to do, if we have the strategies and we are seen as the trusted advisor, we're likely going to be sitting at the table and having those discussions and helping prepare the organization for what comes next. I think that and for those of you that were at TICE this summer, you heard Dr. Keith Keating talk about being a trusted advisor and what it means to have that seat at the table. If we're doing the job right, if we are doing the things right, then we're at the table having those discussions, and we have the ability to help the organization through that moment of transition and change. If we're doing the job right, again, we should be connected so indelibly to the business's strategy that we're always at the table thinking about how to handle that. Now, I realize that's not a truth in every organization, and not every L&D organization is viewed the same way by senior leaders, but that's my perspective as someone who sits outside as a advisor and helper to internal L&D organizations. Bill, as someone who has sat internal, I think you might have a different perspective on that, and I'd love for you to share that because you've sat both internal and external.
And for me, the biggest thing is, I mean, everything you said is absolutely right, even as an internal. You got to become that trusted advisor. You need to create the partnerships. But the mental switch that has to happen, I think, is the conversation has to be framed in the operational lines. It has to be framed in their measures of success. I think too often we L&D folks get stuck in how many classes and courses and how many scores, and none of that matters. I mean, it matters to us sometimes, but what really matters is, how many error rates went down, how many calls were resolved the first time, was the waste, done, is our attrition dropping, and whatever the business metrics are. And when I started framing my business conversations in their and they already had the metrics and they already had assigned dollar limits to them. And when I started showing the variances after we put solutions in place compared to before solution in place and translated it to them, that's when the partnership started. So I think that whole trusted advisor is a process that we can use regardless of whether we're inside or outside. It's about having that conversation and understanding what matters to them and being able to partner with them at that time.
All right. Oh, that was a doozy of a question. Let's see, this question came in from Michelle. How do you balance the needs of diverse business units within an organization when developing a unified learning strategy, one that can support compliance and development goals?
So, Michelle, I think that this comes down to understanding how do you two key things, right? How do you balance the strategic importance of the various business units in the business in terms of what they contribute to the organization's success? And you know what, at some level, there's going to be a bit of, hey, this part of the business is a little more strategic to us. We're going to invest more there. So number one, it is you need to understand where that business sits inside of the organization and kind of how important they are to the overall objectives of the business and make sure that you're aligning to that. I think that there's a second piece to this, which is equally as important, which is when there's disagreement on how that investment decision is made, whose vote is going to count more. So when you talk about governance of how requests come in, when you talk about, when L&D says no to something, who is the person that potentially is going to overrule or decide that their vote counts more than that decision? And then make sure that you have a strong relationship with that person so they understand why that investment decision isn't being made. Again, I think there's, someone said earlier in the chat, there's a finite amount of people, time, and resources. And I think that that's something, particularly when it comes to time. And again, I work outside of the internal organization. Internal L&D, for all of you that work in internal L&D, you live in the world where it's just like, hey, we get it done. If we're working 80 hours a week to get something done, we get it done. And you're not necessarily having conversations with your organization about the true time that went into something, right? And so I think that's where you as L&D organization have to be able to say, look, you need to know it takes X amount of time to do this sort of thing. In order for us to do more of it, it's going to take us X. And that is the balance of equation that you're making every time you make a decision of whether or not to support one organization or the other in terms of their L&D requests. And I think if you're strategically aligned to the business, then your ability to call balls and strikes in that way becomes easier, but you have to know whose vote's going to count more. And you need to make sure that they're comfortable with your decision-making criteria so that they're not overruling you.
Phew. Preach. That is so true. Okay, we got to keep going because I've got like a ton of questions here. Okay, Lisa wants to know, and I like this one because it's pretty specific. What would be a good starting point in gaining buy-in to learning strategy conversations with leadership when the training function has been more reactive rather than strategic? She says she's fairly new to her organization and a department of one.
Yeah. So I think, first of all, is keep in mind your IT department has a strategy, your marketing department has a strategy, your finance department has a strategy, your sales department has a strategy. at some level, I think saying, hey, we need to really make sure that we're aligning our learning to the business strategy should be a fundamentally straightforward conversation. I think depending on I will say that people like Bill and I, we live to have these conversations. So also reach out to people out there like us who are happy to sit and have that conversation with you and help you tee up for that conversation with your leadership on how to have that conversation. And I think that, tapping into great resources like Training Industry and the research that they have around what is the impact of having a learning strategy? Why should organizations invest in learning? There's great resources already here that you can put your pitch together. And then again, there's a community here, whether it's people like Bill and I, people that you're on this webinar with, people that are within, say, the CPTM community, if you happen to be CPTM certified, that are willing to role play that conversation with you and help you practice it. But at the end of the day, every other part of the business has a strategic plan behind it. Learning should be no different. And you're really just coming to the table, having a conversation that hopefully your leadership is going to welcome.
I always said there's a return on learning. I mean, they understand return on investment, especially leadership in that regard, is when you kind of frame that kind of conversation going, hey, I want to know that we are impacting the business properly. I'd like to be a little more strategic about, we're not just an expense. There's a return on learning. How do I do that? Here's an idea I have. What do you think? And that might help start that conversation.
Yeah, I just want to piggyback on what Sean said and the shout out from Lane. The L&D community around you, near and far, is number one, your support system. So that's one of the main reasons that Training Industry does events like this and TICE, our webinars, our membership community, is because we really truly believe that a lot of times you are a team of one or even a team of 3 or 5, and you might be managing a global workforce. And so these connections you make in an event like this, be sure that you've got your camera on in the breakout sessions. Go into the chat and start talking and connecting with other learning leaders who have similar titles as you. Guaranteed you're going to be going through some of the same things, and maybe you can help each other succeed a little faster and help learning and development really solidify the seat at the table, right? All right, let's keep going with these questions. I could go on all day. I get so excited. This one came in from Itis. I hope I'm saying that correctly. What role does stakeholder engagement play in the success of a learning strategy? And what are some of the best practices for gaining and maintaining buy-in from key leaders?
I think stakeholder engagement, Bill, I think you and I both agree this is crucial to the success of a learning strategy. Ultimately, the stakeholders are the ones that are going to ultimately judge you. And in a lot of cases, as it relates to executive stakeholders, they're the ones that are determining how to fund you and what that funding looks like. And so I think that is super important. I think that as when we talked about governance, we've talked about governance from a little bit about intake and how you decide what to fund and what priorities that you're going to take. But I think an important part of the governance model is also how you communicate back out to the business, how you communicate on a regular basis. So whether that is, I think that there are a number of tools, there's NPS tools and things like that, but I think nothing replaces ongoing, consistent, regular dialogue where you are talking about not only what the learning organization has accomplished, what they're currently working on, and what's in the future, but also never losing the opportunity for curiosity and clarity and asking your stakeholders what's ahead and what's keeping them up at night. Because ultimately, if you're staying ahead of that game with your stakeholders, you are going to be built for success. Bill?
Yeah, I say, the difference, I think, where a learning strategy has, I think, a little different than some corporate strategies is it's an active process. So, like Sean mentioned this one we had done with the learning champions. These are actual, performers in their roles, but part of their work now is that's approved is being an advocate for their teams in terms of learning and development. So, that's an active conversation that's happening from them, by them to the L&D team. But with the team. And the other part about this is that when you think about for that governance structure and the intake process, when you start looking at getting your operational leaders as part of this kind of governing team, think of it as your board. That's a conversation. So when I had this example in the call center, for example, those were the people, I mean, we met, and these were VPs that own the business lines, but we met every month because this was important and they had to equal each other. Well, that gave me a lot of conversations and it keeps the dialogue going. And so if the strategy needs to change because something shifted in the business, we didn't have to wait a year. It wasn't like you're going to go visit them and once a year. This is a constant conversation. And I think that, again, helps you create that partnership that gets you at the table.
I love that. All right, we still have a little time, so I hope you guys are okay. I'm going to keep pushing the questions. It's crazy. You think a 2-day virtual event, people would be getting tired by the end, but there's still a big crowd and lots of questions coming in, so let's get to it. This one came in from Jonathan. How do you determine the right mix of delivery methods? Oh, we see this all the time, to meet the diverse needs of learners while aligning with the overall business strategy?
Yeah. I think one of the first things that you have to think about is making sure that you understand how the learners are where they are, right? So we're big proponents of talking about meeting learners where we are, and for us that means understanding what access they have in terms of technology. There's statistics out there that say 70% of frontline workers are undesked, so they are not accessing technology the way that Bill and I access technology in our day, where we have a laptop and 2 monitors and great Wi-Fi. They're on a tablet, maybe on, using their data plan to access learning. So I think that ultimately, when it comes to designing mix, you have to consider what are the technologies that learners are going to have and not have. I think that the other piece that we expound, and this is actually research from training industry that I know that they've talked about, is when it comes to designing the right mix of learning and the different tools and modalities of learning, what training industry's research found was that as long as one of the learner's preferred modalities of learning was included, they were net overwhelmingly more predisposed to view the learning experience as being positive. So what does that mean? It means that, hey, be open to changing the modality, right? If you're a business that's only ever done instructor-led training, break up the modality, give them something else. Because again, as long as one of their preferred modalities is viewed as being used, they tend to view the experience more positively. I think, again, it comes down to understanding what your employees have access to, and then obviously experimenting with modality. Bill, I know you have some great opinions about this as well.
Well, it's about being intentional, and design matters. So, I mean, to Sean's point, if you've got a dispersed workforce, this is there's a point where you go, well, a dispersed means it has to be, online. Well, not necessarily, because if you're intentional about what the purpose is, and now it comes back down to the value proposition of the individual. If the focus is to create collaboration, well, maybe it's time to make the business case to bring people together for X amount of time. Now, maybe there's stuff ahead of time, maybe there's post work, but here's where design matters. It's all about, trying to focus on what's the most efficient and effective manner of meeting that instructional/business objective together. And then kind of trying to figure out, where the good, fast, cheap triangle will play into that. And there's always a balance, and there's never a perfect answer. But when you can help create that, design with intention for people, and so that they understand what the purpose is and why we're asking them to invest their time, then I think you can, come to the point of finding the best blend and mix of modalities to meet that community's needs.
Love it. Yeah, it's not lost on me that I just asked a question of you about an answer that our research for the company that I work for has in it. I asked the question, I kind of knew the answer, but I wanted to hear what you said, Sean, and you called us out, so appreciate you.
It's a test to figure out if I actually know what you guys research on. I understand. I understood the assignment.
I love it. Okay, so let's see. I've got one more question here. I want to fit it in. It's for Jennifer. She wants to go back to SOAP. She's loved this session, she said, but she wants to really make sure she understands. So can you elaborate on the SOAP approach and how it can be used to communicate and align learning initiatives across the different levels of the organization?
So Jennifer, a couple of things. I think number one is we actually in our booth here gave you a fillable template for it and an example. So there are some great opportunities for you to go and play with it. I think number two is Bill and I are always up for a conversation, so we're happy to go in at this at length. However, I think that the thing that, again, how it connects back to the storytelling is if you've done the work and you've kind of said, okay, we know what the strategic businesses of the organization. We know what we need to do from a learning perspective that attaches to it. We can define those things in a way that is deeply consumable by someone who's not in L&D, and they can understand how that aligns to the strategy of the business. That's how you communicate what's on the SOAP. And I have to say, like, that's the important thing. The SOAP is intended to be deeply understood by someone who does not sit in our shoes. It is not like, it is not L&D speak. It is deeply connected to the purpose of the business.
All right, I'm sorry, I'm distracted by all of the kudos and jokes in the chat in this session. But you know, I think anytime Sean brings somebody to the table, and Bill was no exception to the rule, we're gonna have some fun, we're gonna have some good conversations and really enjoy pushing the boundaries of learning and development forward. So Sean, Bill, thank you so much. It's really been a pleasure having you.
Thank you. And we're going to go hang out in the booth on the virtual expo hall. So if anyone wants to come over and hang out with us, we'll be over there for a little bit if anybody wants to come and chat. But guys, thank you for having us. We were honored to be the closing keynote. This was awesome. Thank you for all the great questions.
After party in the We Learn booth. But don't stay too long, because our next round of roundtable discussions are coming up next. Join for a chance to collaborate with other attendees. This is that moment to build the community and talk about some of the most important topics surrounding building a learning strategy. And then, of course, Marissa and I will see you back on the Edison stage this afternoon for the Bright Ideas Exchange to wrap it all up, have a little more moment to connect with each other before we bid you farewell from the Strategy Summit. Thanks so much, you guys.
Thanks, everyone.